Good morning and Freilich Hanukkah. We continue our journey in Hemshech Samach Vav, and dedicating the class yet again to the tragic massacre of the Kedoshim, the holy martyrs that were taken from us. Sydney, Bondi Beach, and now more gruesome details being revealed every day. So we dedicate this class to their neshamas and to the families and to the injured to have complete refuah shleima. And we continue marching with trying to bring more light to eliminate the darkness. So we are in Hemshech Samach Vav. We were in the second Maimer. We're on page 15. Page 15. And what we're learning is, we finished the paragraph at the bottom, close to the bottom of page 15. What we're learning is basically the dynamics of creation and what we human beings accomplish through our efforts in this world. So obviously it's a fundamental theme, the very purpose of existence. As was explained in the previous discourse, the purpose of existence is transform this dark world, tachtenim, into a home for the divine through our Torah mitzvahs. Existence has a certain amount of energy that God vested into it to create it and to sustain it. And that is always going to be at a certain minimal level. But our efforts, our work, increases the flow, and not just increases it more than double. Like he said, even more than the amount that was originally invested in existence. And that's called the Tosfos Eiros that we add. So the creation includes a world, includes Gan Eden, Garden of Eden, even before Adam and Chava, Adam and Eve were placed there, which has a certain higher revelation in existence itself, Hashem Elokim, as we learned. But then, La'avda L'Shama, the work of the human being in the garden and in the general world, as the neshama comes down below, increases literally like a gardener, like a person who's working the land, will increase the produce and in abundance far more than what was there originally. That's the whole point. And that's what we achieve through Torah mitzvahs. In the language that he's been using here, the second Maimer, is that Eden is the source of it all. The Gan comes from Eden. Eden is the level of Tainug Atzmi or Poshet in Atzmus Ein Sof, essentially a seamless, shapeless, undefined, and imperceivable level of divine core. That's Ayin Leidos. No eye can see it today. What we could see and what we could experience is the Gan, the garden that is irrigated from the river that flows from the Eden. So Eden is this highest level that's beyond us. Even Moshe, the Avis, and even Adam before the sin of the tree of knowledge, cannot perceive that level. But from there flows V'nar Yotzim Eden, a river flows from Eden. That river V'lahashkes Sagan, to irrigate and water the garden, and that's what we get. That's ha'ara, like he calls it, a reflection from that pleasure. And that's what the tzaddikim and all the people in Gan Eden, anenim meziva shchina today, when we say neshamas in Gan Eden, what is it doing there? It's benefiting from divine ecstasy, but not the etzem, not the core, not the Eden, the nar, I would say the Gan, that comes through the nar, the river. But la'asid lave, after we finish all our work that we've done in refining this world, and we fulfill the desire, the Eden, you can say, of Nesava Kadosh Baruch Hu, Li'isleis Baruch Dir B'Tachtenim, God's pleasure and desire to have a home in this world. So when that all will accumulate, as we discussed, and that will erupt in a major paradigm shift, and this world will be flooded with Eden itself, the Gili of Eden itself, after all that work. And that's what will be La'asid Lav Eitchis HaMesim. In the ultimate stage, we spoke about the second stage. Whereas today you don't have that Gili, And even the Nevi'im is only a Mesa Mashiach, the earlier stage of Mashiach. But the Iker will be that. And that's why there will also be the parting of the sea, the parting of the river, I should say. The Pasuk says there'll be Vehenif, like we learned, Vehenif. Yodeh al Hanar, Hashem will wave his arm on the river and it will split. Exactly as Kriyas Yamsuf after Yetzias Mitzrayim. There, the parting of the river serves as the interface that somewhat diminishes the flow from the source to the place where the river is flowing. So by Matan Torah, there was a new Gilui Chodesh of mainly Nigla the Torah, the revealed part of Torah. So the Kriyas Yamsuf, the parting of the sea was what we call the splitting, the Bekiah, that allows us to reach from the source, and the river is not diminishing it. Same thing La'asalavi, with the Gilui of Primis HaTorah. Mashiach will teach Torah, but this will be a much deeper level of Torah. What he calls learning Torah b'Bchinas Siriyah, that we can actually visualize it, not just understand and hear it like we do today. So then too there'll be a parting of the sea, of the river, I should say. What river? The river he's talking about, the Nar Yotzeh Me'eden, which was the river, the Euphrates River. In Ruchnius, it means the parting of the sea, the parting of the river that allows us to access Eden, where the river flows from. So instead of the river so-called diminishing or regulating the flow, you'll have Eden itself because of the parting of the river, as we finished learning at the end of the paragraph on page 15. Okay. And the key thing is that La'asado becomes a result of our Avodah and Torah mitzvahs. So even though there was Avodah before too, and there's Avodah also before Matan Torah, the Ovis, but it did not quite achieve what has been achieved over the last few thousand years, especially after Matan Torah. Just to add one more point, I mentioned the Tanya yesterday. In chapter 36 in Tanya, he also says that the revelation that will be La'asado kfar hoya me'enze b'Matan Torah. So it doesn't say that here in Samach Vav, but in Tanya he says that it was a taste of this divine revelation at Matan Torah. But clearly from the Samach Vav, it's clear that it was only a taste. The ultimate experience of Eden will be La'asad Lavik, as we just finished reviewing. So now we'll continue. Bottom of page 15. The pages can be found at samachvav.com. And let us continue here. Ba'inyan. So now he's going to explain what exactly is the Nahar, what is this river exactly, and what is Eden, more specific, more details about it. The Inyan in this is, the Hini Yadua, it's known, what is the level of Nar? The Nar hu b'chinas Binah. When you say river, generally speaking, in Kabbalistic terms, in the spheres, it's the level of Binah. Again, the sources you can find down below in the footnotes. And what is Eden? If the Nar is river, is the river is Binah, what is Eden? Eden hu b'chinas Chochma. Eden is the level of Chochma. So now we have Chochma, a river flows from it, that's Binah, and it flows into the garden to irrigate it, which is where Gan Eden, where Adam and Chava were placed, and now the Neshamas are there after they finish their work in this world, they go to Gan Eden, and they benefit from the flow of the river, which is a reflection of Eden. Basically, they're benefiting from Binah that's receiving from Chochma, as we're going to discuss. But now he's giving it a placement in the so-called cosmic order where these levels so-called dwell. I say so-called because it's always, remember, it's not physical levels, it's conceptual levels, but nevertheless, each one has their so-called place. Hagamshin is bar le'el. Now you're telling me it's Chochma, but you said earlier that Eden is Tainuga Atzmi. That's higher than all the spheres. Hagamshin is bar le'el, the Eden ubchinas Tainuga Atzmi, hanelam uposhet sheba'atzmus erein sof. So though we learned earlier that Eden is the core and concealed and seamless, undefined pleasure in Atzmus Ein Sof, Shashua Melech B'Atzmusei. If you're already going to say it's in spheres, it would be Atik, or even Pnimius of Atik in Keser, not Chochma. Nevertheless, says the Rebbe Rashab, Hini b'derech klal, zeu b'bchinas Chochma b'bchinas ha'pnimius shaba. However, in general terms, when you break it down, it is indeed higher, but it also refers to, in general terms, to the inner dimension of Chochma and its pnimius, shalamayla miseder ishtalshlus, which is higher than seder ishtalshlus. So let me explain what this means, because as soon as you read this, especially if you've never been accustomed to how Chassidus explains ideas, it's like, what is he answering? Is it Chochma? Is it higher than Chochma? So the first thing, as I said, everything that we're dealing with here is not tangible physical items. Like, for example, you say it's either day or night, or it's either daimim, semeya, chaya, medaber. It can't be both. A table is not a chair, and a frog is not a lion, and an animal is not a flower. And you don't say that it's both, generally, or macrocosm or microcosm. Everything has its place, because that's Zman and Makam Gashmi. When you're talking about physical time and space, it's very much structured. That doesn't mean there isn't overlap. You could have twilight between day and night. You could have the dawn breaking, it's still half dark, half light. But generally speaking, everything is structured and everything has its boundaries. The land is not the sea, and so on. The brain is not the heart. In Ruchnius, even though there's also parameters, but it comes far more amorphous. So, for example, you say Atzilus, Bri, Yitzir, Asiya, four spiritual dimensions. There is, however, an Atzilus in Bria and a Bria in Atzilus. So it's still structured, not taking away the structure, but the structure becomes less rigid, if you wish. The higher you go in Ruchnius, the less the structure is significant. Like I've given the example many times about upon conception, when a new child is conceived, a new life is concealed. So an egg is fertilized by a seed. And what do we have? And God blesses it, it conceives, and what happens? It's fertilized, and now there's a conception of one cell. One cell. That cell is so tiny, barely visible to the naked eye, like a hair, like a follicle of hair. And that cell will split into two, and then into four, into 8, 16, 32, and so on. To the point when a child is born, it could be close to 35 to 75 trillion cells or more even. Many cells are lost as the child emerges upon birth. But the point being is, so if someone asks you, where's the structure in that one cell? You'll say, well, it's all so concentrated, you can't really see it. You want structure, you have to wait after the first trimester, the second trimester. So you see from that, we even find a physical example, that the higher you go, so to speak, or the more internal you go, the boundaries become much more blurred. Doesn't mean they aren't there, but it's much more, how do you define it? Is it potential? Is it conceptual? Is it archetypal? I mean, there's a lot of different words we can use. Now, that's still Gashmis. Remember, the conception is still a Gashmis Dikasel. When you go into the spiritual dimensions, all these levels become far more amorphous, like nebulous, where you can't really distinguish. This doesn't mean they don't exist. There's a difference in Chochma and Binah, and a difference in Atzilus and Bria, and there's a difference in Keser and Chochma, but the way we distinguish it is a far more subtle way. That's one point I just want to make overall in understanding spiritual dimensions. But then there's another thing. There's the microcosm, macrocosm concept. Remember, everything begins with Hashem Echad, one God, one seamless singularity. Eirei Sof before the Tzimtzum, even though we say there are levels, but in general terms we speak about it as one seamless divine energy. Atzmus is less mandapolig. When you talk about Atzmus, you don't even say one, it's beyond it all. But essentially there's no distinctions. So the very concept of distinctions is something God desired. Just like the Avedis HaKodesh is a sefer from Rab Meir Ibn Gabbai, he says, Kashem, Sheyesh lekechi bebilti bal gvul, kach yesh lekechi begvul. Just as God has the ability to express himself in infinite manners, he also has the ability to express the power of the finite. So God has the power to create structure. But obviously, we talk about God himself is beyond any structure. But the way he created the structure, even though in the physical world it will be a very defined structure, and water and land are two separate things, and the windpipe and the food pipe are very different, and they cannot mix with each other, or else it would be dangerous. However, it all originates from one singularity. And as such, one of the things the Eibishter brilliantly, if you wish, infused into existence is the concept that unity can be found in every level, because every level encompasses all the other levels, what we call hiskalulus. So hiskalulus means that Chochma has Binah within it, and Binah has Chochma within it. You can even say the land has partial sea in it, and the sea has land, but in this physical world, they have to remain very clearly distinct. But in the higher levels, the hiskalulus is more prominent. A third point, and that's the final point I want to make, which is the most important, is the microcosm concept. That everything is created in a way that, like a hologram, that all the details can be found in each detail. So we talk about, for example, I'll give an example from the Mishnah. There's a Masechta called Masechta Taharis. It's a Masechta. It's one of the tractates. It's called Taharis. And there's also an entire section, this Shisha Sidre Mishnah, 6 order, and one of them is also called Seder Taharis. There's a Seder Taharis and there's a Masechta Taharis. So how do you explain that? That's because Taharis in general talks about all laws of purity and impurity. In that itself, there's a microcosmic chapter, the tractate called Taharis. Same thing with Keichavim. When we say stars, when you say the word stars, Keichav includes all stars. But we know there are many different types of stars. And one of the stars is actually called Keichav, a star. So you find this concept of microcosm, macrocosm throughout Torah, where in general terms you may call it one name, but when you break it down, each detail has in it an aspect of the macrocosm. And this comes back to what we're learning right now. When the Eibishter created the idea of Tainug Atzmi, Uposhet, even though it's completely removed from existence, it's beyond Chochma and Binah, but he wanted us to have access to it. So therefore, in a way, he implanted in certain places a taste of it, if you wish, or an experience of it. So though it's not pure, we'll call it pure Atik, but Atik manifests within Chochma, in Pnimius of Chochma. So what we're going to learn now is that though Eden fundamentally is beyond everything, like he said here, Tainug Atzmi Poshet, but in Chochma, in the Pnimius of Chochma, not the Chetzenius, in the inner dimension of Chochma, there is you can call it a seed, trying to find the right word, an experience of Tainug HaPoshet from Atik. The reason for that is because, again, Hashem wanted us to create a Dira B'Tachtenim, that in this world we should have the experience of all the levels of the divine. Had he created everything so distinct to the point that they cannot interact with each other, in other words, there was no hiskalus, like I just explained, and no microcosm, macrocosm, we ultimately would reach a point where we can't go higher. You hit Chochma, that's it. It's the conscious intelligence or conscious wisdom, the spark of an idea, but that's not the case. In Chochma, you will have, like he's going to say now, Pnimius Abbas, Pnimius Atik, the Pnimius of Chochma carries within it the Pnimius of Atik. So you say, 1 second, is it Atik or is it Chochma? That's why I gave this longer introduction to explain that, to understand that things are not quite black and white in that sense. So Atik is Atik, and Chochma is Chochma, but Chochma has within it a so-called piece of Atik, if you wish. Like, the word piece is probably not an adequate word, but you get the idea. So that's somewhat of an introduction that explains many different things in Chassidus that you'll find. They'll say, this level is Malchus, and then suddenly you say, this level is Chochma. You say, 1 second, is it Chochma or is it Malchus? Is it Keser or is it Malchus? And this generally explains what I just said. The 3 points I just made are critical to understand that. But in case of Chochma and Atik, or what we're calling here Chochma and Tainuga Etz Atzmi, that's what he's specifically discussing here. There's a particularly unique relationship. Now the plot thickens; it gets even more complicated. But I don't want to complicate it further right now. So let's just suffice with that to be able to understand what the next lines that we're going to learn. If anybody wants to ask anything on this, I'm happy to answer. Okay. I'll just give one more example because it may be helpful. Remember, we learned about the 10 hidden spheres, and there's 10 revealed spheres. So generally speaking, the Esser spheres, Hagluyas, revealed spheres, we talk about are the 10 spheres of Atzilus. What about the 10 hidden spheres? So you may recall, there's actually a footnote from the Rebbe, a note in Tafshin Ches, 1948, in the Maimorim of the Frierdiker Rebbe. The Rebbe has a long note about it, that Esser spheres, Hagluyas is explained in different ways, different levels. In Kisva Rizal, it's mostly after the Tzimtzum, or not mostly. It's explained as the 10 spheres of Ak, sometimes the 10 spheres of Atik. When you learn Chassidus, Chassidus says Tesla spheres Agnuzis is the level we learned it in the previous Maimer of Shir Asmei B'Koyach of Malchus of Ein Sof before the Tzimtzum. So which one is it? So this is another a perfect example of this microcosm macrocosm idea, as well as the fact that these levels can exist on many levels. We say Keser. So there's Keser of Atzilus, there's Keser of Bria, there's Keser of Yitzira Asiya, there's Keser Kloli, Ak is a Keser. So the answer is there's Keser in each level, but there's also a Keser Kloli. They all have something in common. The point being is that you will find everything in every level. The question is, what's dominant? What's dominant? But you'll always have both elements. And that's vital because we're talking about interfacing. This is the additional point I want to make. Interfacing between two opposites. You're talking about a God, a creator, that's completely beyond us, and a creation. So you think, how could these two ever unite? You could say we can serve God. We can do his mitzvahs. We can follow whatever he tells us to do. But how do we become one? We talk about achdus. That all becomes unified, integrated. The only way to explain it with seichel, not with kol yachol, not with saying God can do anything, is by interfacing. By saying that this Hashem Echad, he implanted that Echad in every level. So when we do our Avodah, the details, in distinct levels, we are accessing also the Echad, the oneness of the divine in each detail, and then bringing it together, and thus bridging these two realities. So that's essentially the idea. If Keser, or in this case Atik, pleasure, didn't exist in Chochma, we wouldn't have access to it. Chochma is more on our terms. So in Chochma, God implanted, he infused it with a level of Tainug Atzmi. So the same idea, for example, we do mitzvahs. So each mitzvah is a specific mitzvah. Tzitzis is not tefillin. And tefillin is not kashrus. And matzah is not the daled minim, the 4 species we take on sukkahs. And yet, on all of them, we say the same opening. Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech ha'olam, asher kedishanu b'mitzvos v'tzivanu. All the mitzvahs have the same blessing, the beginning. Blessed is you, God, the creator, the king of the universe, that sanctified us with these mitzvahs. And then you say, la'niach tefillin, al atifas talis, al the tilas lulav, alachilas matzah. So how do you explain that? Because you want the oneness of God, of the mitzvah, of the mitzvah mitzvahs, to be permeating every detail. So the opening of the blessings are all one, they're all similar. But then each of them infuses that particular mitzvah, whether it's tefillin or talis and so on, with its particular energy. And there you have the joining of like Sevav Kalam and Mamala Kalam, and using the language of the previous Maimer. A all-encompassing divine energy entering into Mamala Kalam and into a structured divine energy. So that's yet another way of understanding this bridge that we're discussing now. So let's go back again. So Eden, he says, is Chochma. Even though a Gamshin is bar le'il, the Eden of B'chinas Tainug Atzmi Anelu Pasha Shabbat Musei Ein Sof. And though we explained earlier that Eden is a level of core and hidden and seamless the pleasure in Atzmos Ein Sof. However, in general terms, if you don't break it down, this manifests within Chochma. That's the way I'm translating it. Which level of Chochma hapnimiyas shaba? In the inner dimension of Chochma. Shalamaylam is Seder Ishtalshlus. So now he's saying in Chochma, which is the beginning of Seder Ishtalshlus, there's a level that's called Lamaylam is Seder Ishtalshlus. It sounds like a contradiction. It's not, based on what I just explained. Because Chochma has an element of it, an element of higher than Ishtalshlus in Chochma. And we'll discuss more of that as we go along, more details to understand how that manifests in Chochma. Where do you see that in Chochma? So he says, V'hu, now we're getting into this is a statement made in Eitz Chaim that is a very strong statement. I see footnote 32. Let me just see something 1 second. Yeah. Who begins Pnimius Abba. Remember, Chochma in Kabbalistic terminology sometimes referred to Abba, like Abba ve'ima. Chochma and Binah is like father and mother. So Pnimius Abba means Pnimius Chochma. So who begins Pnimius Atik? It's an expression in Eitz Chaim, pre-Eitz Chaim, as he cites in the footnotes. Now, how do you say that? Pnimius Abba is Pnimius Atik. It's two different levels. That's why I gave this longer explanation, introduction, to understand that. Shezeu b'chinas hanelam de Chochma. In Chochma itself, we have levels. There's the reveal level of Chochma. That's when you have a spark of an idea. We usually explain Chochma is the beginning of conception. We conceive of an idea. Binah is developing the idea, the river, which we'll soon discuss. Chochma is the Nekuda. Like Chochma is the Yud, we learned earlier in the end of last Maimer. Binah is the Hey. That's the revealed part of Chochma. But within Chochma, there's a Nelam, there's a level called Hanelam de Chochma. Shaloi nitten lenes klal. That was not given to benefit from at all. It remains removed. In Chochma, you have something that's removed. And that shows, that you see, so Chochma has different levels. And like it says, and that's written elsewhere. I turned the page 16. I just want to see quickly here. So let me give you a little, just a little explanation, just to make it not so cryptic. So where do we see in Chochma this Koyach Hanela? So here's the point. Chochma is made up of two words. Koyach Ma. You may have learned that. Chochma is Koyach Ma, the power of Ma. What's Ma? So Ma literally in Hebrew means what? It's like a wondrous statement. What? What was that? Ma. Mazeh. What is that? Ma also means bittul. You say nochnu ma. What? It's referring to a level of bittul. You feel the shame ma, shame of bittul. Meaning essentially there's no ego, there's no sense of self. So what does it mean when we say Chochma is koyach ma? So koyach ma is explained in many different ways. I'll just give one explanation. When you get an idea falls into your mind, let's say you're struggling with a dilemma, or you have a question, or just an idea pops into your mind, a new idea, an epiphany. What does the experience feel like? So it's interesting. If you dissect it for a moment, on one hand, there's a new idea that's just come to you. But on the other hand, there's a deep pleasure. It's like after struggling with a dilemma or asking a question, and suddenly something comes to you like that wow moment, like aha. That's a ma moment. So on one hand, it's a koyach chochma. It's a faculty. Because there is an idea that fell into your mind. Binah will be needed to develop it. Because you know how many ideas we have that disappear and dissipate as quickly as they come? We can't even imagine how many. But there are ideas. Like you have an idea. I just had an idea this morning. I mean, more than one. So what do? I write it down immediately if I feel I want to develop it, because I know it's easy to forget. And later you start thinking, what was the idea I had? And I was dealing with something we're dealing with online with AI and how to develop something. But anyway, it doesn't matter what it was. The point is that the ideas can dissipate quickly. So on one hand, an idea has entered into your consciousness. So you can call it chochma a koyach, but it's still ma. is still something very wondrous. And you like say, where did that come from? And sometimes you think, where did the idea come from? And we know it doesn't come from the shower head, even though many ideas fall into our heads in the shower. So where does it come from? It comes from what Chassidus calls koyach hamaskil, from Keser. But Keser is hidden from us. So we don't see the source of where ideas come from. We only have the experience of the idea. So here you see in Chochma two aspects. The Chochma Hagolei, the revealed part, is the idea that manifested. Still a seed, it's only a kernel that needs to be developed, but it's something to talk about. And then there's the Ma part, the wonder of it, the awe. In Tanya, in chapter 35, in the Haggadah, the Alter Rebbe says something fascinating. It's cited very often in Chassidus. It says that it's the only place the Alter Rebbe writes in Tanya something he heard from his teacher, the Maggid of Mizrich, the Mizrich Maggid. He says, Shamaiti Memori, I heard from my master. The Alter Rebbe is writing in a gloss, in a note in Tanya chapter 35. I heard from my Vaad that Chochma, in Chochma resides the sense of Hu Lavade ve'ein zulase. That Chochma senses that God alone and nothing else. Basically the oneness, and you say the exclusivity and the singularity of godliness in Chochma. But Chochma is the beginning of Seichel. Seichel has already parameters. But because Chochma has this premius that we're calling the Nelam, the Koyach HaNelam, so Chochma also has a level of Bittel. Binah is considered much more of a Yesh. And Yesh doesn't mean necessarily anything like arrogant, but Yesh means it has body. Once you have a Binah developed idea, it has structure, it has an outline, it has details, and so on. Chochma still retains a certain element of what I like to call awe. The awe of feeling an experience that's greater than yourself. Because you say, where did this idea come from? It's like imagining something greater than yourself. So there's a certain sense of awe, of majesty, of something that's not definable by seichel, pure seichel. It's not purely a logical statement. It's also an experience of feeling something, a reality that's greater than yourself. That is the ma of Chochma. Where is that coming from? That's the keser that's within Chochma. And that's what he's coming to say here. That Chochma has two parts. So it's true that Eden, pure Eden is Keser or Atik, you could say Tainug, Atzmi. But Chochma, but in general, that's the level of Chochma, the premius of Chochma. Not the Chitzenius, not the outer, not the revealed dimension, the inner dimension. Chochma has this Tainug in it. If you may, I don't know if any of you remember, but in Ayin Beis, the first volume, there was a whole section, very complicated, where he said that Chochma is really Tainug. It's just, I don't want to say masquerading, it's Tainug dressed up in Seichel. In other words, usually we talk about Seichel. Seichel is intelligence, rational thinking, and so on. But Chassidus comes to explain that Seichel really is God's way of manifesting his higher reality into rational terms so we can relate to it. But it's really not about Seichel. It's about experiencing a reality greater than yourself. That's what the mind is. Emotions are the subjective feelings that we have that relate to us. Do I like it? Don't I not? Chesed, Gvura, Teferes. These are all emotional, subjective experiences. Seichel, the real meaning and purpose of Seichel is to help us relate to an existence that beyond ourselves. For example, animals are primarily balimidis. That's why they don't contemplate and they don't philosophize. They don't imagine a reality beyond them because that's not their purpose. Their purpose is to function, to survive, to breed, protect their young, and accomplish whatever God created them to accomplish. They're part of the clockwork, the program of existence. A human being has the element of being able to rise, to raise our eyes to heaven and seek out something beyond our own survival. That is essentially what Seichel is in general, and specifically Chochma. So Chochma has the ability, even though it's not so conscious, but Chochma is a carrier, you can say an interface into Keser, into a reality that's greater than our consciousness. And the bridge is Chochma because Chochma on one hand has consciousness, on the other hand it has super-consciousness of Keser. That's, in short, what he's saying here in just a few lines. But just to give a little more palpable or palatable language, to be able to understand this idea of Chochma and Keser. He's going to say more about this. So let's read inside it. I will stop for questions, but I want to just read a few more lines before I do. So Chochma le'nit lenes, like it says elsewhere, v'gam kamosh mefarish b'zeyar. I'm on top of page 16. And also, as he explains in Zohar, the Ikar Bechinas Eden hu bekeser. The primary level of Eden is in Keser, like we've been discussing. Benikra Eden Ilah. And there it's called the higher Eden. So he's now introducing another term, the higher Eden. And again, the footnotes give you the sources. So even according to what it says in Zohar, he says, Tzarech Lemer, Dezeu Gamkin Bebchinas Chachmis Timasha Bekeser. That even this, what it says in Zohar, that the level of Eden Ilah, you have to say it's referring to the supernal, or we'll call it the superconscious Chachma. Chachmis Timah, again, needs another introduction. Chachmis Timah is essentially the superconscious source of Chachma Gluya. So we've been talking about Chochma, the inner Chochma, the outer. Inner Chochma is rooted in Chachmas Timah, which is in Keser, usually in Arich. And this is the inner dimension of Chachmas Timah, which is fundamentally concealed. So now he's talking about Eden, and still referring to it as Chochma. So he's further explaining it's not just Chochma and Atzilus, but even Eden, as the Zohar calls it, Eden, is called Keser. It's still Chochma Shtima in Keser. U'kumavur b'makam acher. V'chein hu b'madreges al yenis yeser ad reish kol dargin. And so is it with Eden, that's in all the levels above, even to the top highest levels, all the way to the highest levels. So let me explain this, and then I'll stop for questions. What he's basically saying, based on what I explained earlier, that everything is microcosm, macrocosm, and everything is iskalos, that the truth is Eden exists on many levels. I mentioned before Atik and Primius Atik. He mentioned it briefly, but he didn't say it on Eden explicitly. So we have here Eden refers to Chochma. So he's explaining Primius Chochma because it has within it that element of Primius Atik. Now we explain Eden, even according to the Zohar that calls it Keser, it's in Keser, Eden Ilah, it's still Chochmas Timah within Keser. And which level is Chochmas Timah? There's two levels. There's Chochmas Timah that's only hidden but can be revealed, and there's Sosum Be'etzem, like he says, Sosum Etzaratzme, fundamentally concealed. But then he says that Eden exists on higher levels. He doesn't spell it out, but higher would be Atik, would be higher than Chochmas Timah. And so goes all the way to the highest levels in Akudim, in Ak, all the way to the Keser of Ak. He's not spelling it out here specifically. He just wants to make it clear that Eden exists on all levels. But for all practical purposes, we're discussing Eden here on the level of Chochma, namely Primis HaChochma. And then he's going to go over to what the Nard is, what is the river. But before we get to the river, let's stop here for a moment if anybody wants me to clarify anything. Okay. So let's continue that. Nar Hayetzim Eden, what's the level of the river that exits, that is derived from Eden, comes from Eden, that leaves Eden, the river that flows from Eden, Hu B'chinas Binah. That's the level of Binah, like he said at the beginning of the paragraph at the bottom of the last page. Binah comes after Chochma. Zeu tainig neshamas began Eden. And that's the tainug, the pleasure of neshamas and Gan Eden, what we called before the reflection of Eden, not Eden itself. So it's the tainug of the neshamas and Gan Eden, shehu, and where do they get their pleasure from? Al hasoge shemasigim elikus, on their comprehension that they comprehend godliness, and that gives them deep pleasure. That gives them pleasure. Shezeo b'chinas bina. That's the level of Binah. As he writes in Tanya chapter 39. So what he's done here is now given placement to God, the Eden and the Nar. Eden is Chochma, Primi is Chochma, and the deeper level of that deeper inner pleasure, going all the way to the highest levels. Binah is the way that pleasure manifests in comprehension of godliness for the neshamas in Gan Eden, as we learned earlier. Basically, based on what he said earlier, meaning the gili of Pnimius Chochma, Pnimius Abba, Pnimius Atik, and all that comes with that will be Lasadlove. But today we have the gili of Binah. So what he's added here is basically the Chochma Binah connection. But now he's going to explain that. And he continues and says like this. Hine, and now, Kishem Shagili Shanim Shel Be'elamis. Just as the gili, the divine revelation that manifests within existence, we know it has to manifest in a concealed way. Shum B'chinas Malchus D'Atzilus, that gili, that as Nimshach and Elamis comes through Malchus of Atzilus. Malchus is the last of the 10 spheres. And from there it draws into existence. Zewai de Hester V'Helam Malchus. Like we learned earlier about Yam Suf. He said the Yam is Malchus. That's through the covering and the concealment of Malchus. Shemalemes u'masteres ala oir. Because the energy is too intense for existence to contain it. So Malchus serves as a concealer. Malchus funnels and channels all the spheres that create existence into a concealed state on the oir. Ukiyadua, the Malchus who be chinas dibra elyon. As it's known, Malchus is the dibur, the supernal speech. God speaking. Speaking is more diminished than thought. And speech, even though on one hand it's revealing what you're and communicating what you want, what your mind is saying, but it's still is done so with a limited flow. It's ma'ilum u'machas, conceals and covers on the energy of the hamshacha. So when a person speaks, they're always speaking with less intense oir than what they're thinking. So therefore, Malchus, being dibur, is essentially a funnel, a channel of God's thoughts and the divine energy that can now enter into existence. So, okay. U'kamoy derech mashal ba'adam. He's going to give now an example, a human example. In the adibur, the letters of speech, hem kelim lahaseichel v'amidus. They're containers for intelligence and for emotions. So letters are just containers. They're just channels. They're not the ideas themselves. When I'm speaking now, the letters I'm using, if you separated them from the idea, it would be a keli without an oir. The fact of speech is a keli to the oir. But it is, if you really break it down, just like the letters on a page are kelim to the idea that you want to convey on that page. Here we're talking dibur, not maisen, not writing. We're talking about speech. So we see that. Now it's also a keli for midas. I want to share an affectionate feeling, I love you. Or any other feeling, you express it through words. So the words are kelim for seichel and midas. Shehem nimshachim u'mislapshim bay. The seichel and the midas, the intelligence and the emotions, are transmit and manifest within the letters of speech. Ach makom mokim. So even though it's true they are channels of expression, nevertheless, the letters ha'esis he malimim ala seichel. No question that the letters conceal partially the seichel, shebeteichon, within the seichel that is within these letters, umatspinim oisei beteichon. So they conceal the seichel, and the letters themselves are also, per se, also concealers. You'll see in a second what he's adding here. Shari hakotten, because we see a child. Af shemevin kol ha'esis v'atevis v'emram heitav, a child, even though he's already speaking, and he is able to express and articulate letters and words. Ve'emram heitov. He understands letters and words, and he also is able to articulate them well. Nevertheless, he does not at all understand the depth of the intelligence within these letters. So he can say letters, he can repeat the same thing. Let's say you're learning with a child, the first Mishnah in the Gemara. Or you're learning, for that matter, a piece in Tanya or Chassidus. So the child can articulate the letters, he understands the words, but does he understand all the oir within it? No. So that tells you immediately that letters and words, as much as they express, they also conceal. I'm still trying to understand the difference between malimim ala seichel ushebetechen umatspinim eisebeteichen. I think he's saying 2 points. One is that it conceals the intelligence, and in the letters themselves, they're concealed. So number one is concealing the intelligence in general in the mind of the teacher. So when the teacher is speaking, he's not saying everything that he knows, but also the letters themselves are dependent on with the level of the student. You could say those letters, and one student will understand more, another student will understand less. So the letters themselves are also concealers, meaning even on the seichel within the letters, not just the seichel beyond the letters. I think that's what he said. That's what he meant here, maybe. I have to think it through a bit more. Rak mishu atzmei chacham mekedem. Only someone that was initially a chacham mekedem, meaning not a cotton, someone who's wise from the outset. Ozai mevin al yidei esis. Then he'll understand. You give him these words, these letters, he'll understand the deeper meaning because he's already a chacham. So you see from that words of expression, speech, is a concealing factor. It reveals, but it reveals in a limited way. Aval mahusa esis atzman, but the very nature, the very personality, the very fabric, if you wish, of the letters themselves, hu b'chinas helam legabe mahusa seichel v'amidus. So this is the letters as they're expressing an idea, but the letters themselves are empty shells. It's like a keli without anything inside it. So the letters themselves are a complete concealment compared to the personality or the fabric, if you wish, of the seichel and of the midas. That's the moshel. And what's the nimshel? This is the moshel Adam. Now he's going to bring it back to Malchus and Dibra Elyon. Ukamoike Yuvan Be'esi is the Malchus. So too we'll understand the letters of Malchus. Shein malimim umatspinim, they conceal, and matspinim, I think, like he said before, means they don't just conceal in the energy, within them they also conceal ala chabad, and the Chochma Binah das umidis da'atzilis hamislapshim b'dibra elyon, on the intelligence and the emotions of Atzilus that manifest or get enclosed in this supernal speech of Malchus, shelo yizgar leklal bebriya, that the inner seichel and midas, what we just talked about, will not be at all revealed in Bria. Only somewhat of a diminished reflection alone, that will be revealed. Like in the case of the cotton, that will hear the oisis, can even articulate them, but not fully appreciate the main oir of the seichel and the midas. Okay. The next he's going to continue and say, so now we'll come to understand what Neshama's understanding Gan Eden. That's the level, because the Gan Eden is in Bria. I'll read another line. Now he refers specifically to the Gan Eden Elyon is Bria, Gan Eden Atachten is Yitzira generally. So the same thing, the Gili of the Gan Eden Elyon of Bria. We're talking about Gan Eden now, the Gan, not the Nor and not the Eden. That refers to supernal Binah, Ima Ilah, the mother, the supernal mother, which is Binah. Mekanana, nests in Kursaya means the Kisei, the world of the throne, which is the world of Bria in this terminology. Shazeu b'chinas hanor sheyetze me'Eden. That's the river Binah that leaves and is flows from Eden. And I think I'm going to stop here because the next section needs more elaboration. It'll be a little confusing because he's now going to go back to thought and speech. But he's going to explain essentially what Nar, the river, is, what the Gan is. And of course, we're going to go back to Eden as we continue learning. But I'll stop here. Here's a good place to stop. But you see the connection. He's starting to develop this whole concept. Any questions? Okay, very quiet on the front lines I see today. Okay, I'll just say this, just to make this a little more, apply it more. The bottom line that we're learning here is essentially different levels of divine revelation. With the ultimate being, of course, Eden, the essential core pleasure of Atzmus Ein Sof. But also recognizing that there are reflections of that, and that's what they experience in Gan Eden. So you could ask yourself, what is this relevant to us? We're neither in Gan, and we're not in Gan Eden, and we're not in Eden. All this seems to be levels that are completely beyond us. After Adam and Chava were expelled from Gan Eden, they're not in Gan Eden anymore. And Eden for sure is not accessible until Mashiach, until after Lasad Love. So the answer is that we don't learn about this just to tell us about events or experiences that are outside of us. We all have these levels within us, even today. You may recall in the previous Maimer, and he brings it in Tanya and other places, he says, Elam chatira b'chayecha. When a person learns Torah, and a person does a mitzvah, we may not have the full experience as they have it in Gan Eden, and definitely not in Eden, but you have a taste of it. So the fact is that even in this world, this lifetime, we're involved most of the day in material activities, mostly physical pleasures. But we are given the opportunity, when we wake up in the morning, you say Moeda'ani, and then you daven, and then later you learn Torah, or learn Chassidus before davening. These are all the opportunity to have a taste of Gan Eden, and even of Eden itself. Yeah, albeit in a way that relates to us on our level today. But we shouldn't think that these ideas are just pure abstract theories that don't relate to us. They're all connected to us. So when we say V'ahavtas Hashem Elokecha, you love God, b'chol levavcha, b'chol nafshecha, b'chol meidecha, with all our heart, with all our soul, and on all our might. These are all experiences of godliness. So when you learn Chassidus about these levels, you absolutely can say, where do I find these levels within me? It doesn't have to be the full-blown experience of a tzaddik in Gan Eden Elyon, but relative to you, anything that brings you a little divine pleasure, something that's godly, instead of just physical pleasure, lahavdil, is a taste of these levels. Obviously, in Chassidus, it talks about many different levels, and we have to climb the ladder and, so to speak, grow. But I just wanted to make it clear that this isn't just some abstract ideas. This is very relevant to our lives right now. We'll see how this all plays itself out. The Rebbe Rashab is just beginning this hemshech, but ultimately he's going to come to explain what we achieve even with one mitzvah. So when you do now a mitzvah today, or any small act, you light a Hanukkah candle tonight, or any other good deed that you do, tzedakah and so on, you're generating Tainu Ge'elyon. You're generating Eden itself. It may not be fully revealed, and it may be a little reflection only, but that's what you're achieving. So this is not something that just in the future we'll have the full-blown experience of it. But like he says now, Yom Yom, that when Mashiach comes, we will yearn for the days when we struggled and had to do a mitzvah, because we won't have to struggle then. Then it will be all obvious. But today, the struggle is actually what creates these levels of profound pleasure. So just wanted to say that, because in learning all this, you can get lost in these ideas and say, what connection does it have to my life? Okay.
Thank you, Rabbi. As you're saying that, I'm sitting here in Israel watching the Hanukkah candles. So I appreciate your putting it into that perspective.
Yeah, so that's the power. You light a candle, a small candle. Don't think it's just in your little environment. That candle, first of all, light, as we know today, energy is the what they call the ripple effect, the butterfly effect. That a butterfly flaps its wings wherever you are in Israel, and it can create a typhoon in Singapore. So light has the ability to change existence. So your little candle, yes, generates the highest levels and all the way to God's pleasure, especially now. We need it more than ever with events lately that have happened, the tragic events in Sydney. And again, I want to dedicate this class to that because we need more light than ever and more comfort than ever and more strength than ever with all that's going on. Where in Israel are you?
Spot.
Spot. Okay. Here we are, all connected. All connected. Okay. Are there any other comments, questions?
You mentioned that Chochma rooted in pleasure in Kesser. And then you said that when we have the Chochma in us actually shows in Seichel, we say, aha, it's our Seichel that touch Chochma at this point. So can we say that our intellect pleasure connected with this Kesser side?
Yeah. Well, Seichel has two parts. You can revel in the pure intelligence of the Seichel, but you can also see it as a divine revelation in your mind that God is giving you the ability to be intelligent, to understand something. So it's more than just a rational scientific equation, but it also has an element of divine pleasure because you're experiencing a reality greater than yourself. In other words, the ultimate seichel is not just to understand something. It's to see that you can that you can experience something beyond yourself, beyond your ego, beyond your needs, something that's higher than you.
Thank you. And from this point of view, when we have talking about some kind of new creation, new invention, and we have honor on some kind of developing of new device, it's not exactly our creation, it's the Chochma and higher that gives us the chance to invent that. Yes?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure. Okay, we'll stop the recording here. I'm on page, where are we? Here we're on page 16. 16, we'll stop.